A young mother bundled her infant into the back seat just as the skies broke open. The storm was already fierce, sheets of rain hammering the pavement, lightning splitting the horizon, thunder echoing so close it rattled the windows. She told her relatives she was heading to her sister's house, just a short drive across town, a routine visit she had made dozens of times. Despite the weather, she seemed calm, almost determined, as though the rain was just another obstacle she had learned to live with. Her family believed she would be fine. She was cautious, protective, never reckless. But once she pulled away from the driveway, she and her child were swallowed by the storm, and no one would ever see them alive again. At first, there was no reason to panic. Storms like this one had a way of severing the world, knocking out power lines and silencing phone signals. Hours passed and no word came, but the family rationalized it away. Maybe she had pulled over somewhere safe, waiting for the rain to ease. Maybe she reached her sister's house but couldn't call because the landline was down. Each explanation was fragile but believable, enough to hold back fear for just a little longer. They kept telling themselves she was fine, repeating it until it felt like truth. But as night fell, unease crept in. Her sister confirmed she never arrived. The family tried to retrace the drive in their minds, the familiar route that curved through rural stretches of road, past open fields and low creeks now swelling with water. If she had crashed, someone would have seen. If she had stopped, someone would have noticed. The storm had reduced visibility to almost nothing, and now the dark made everything worse. They tried calling her phone again and again, only to be met with silence. By the next morning, worry had shifted into something heavier. Relatives drove the route themselves, squinting through mud and debris, but found nothing. They called hospitals, police stations, anyone who might have received word of a stranded motorist, but her name never appeared. The storm's aftermath made everything harder. Roads were blocked, rivers had flooded past their banks, and neighborhoods were still without power. For a while, the chaos of disaster kept her absence from standing out. She was one missing voice among thousands. But to her family, it was different. They knew something was wrong. When police were finally notified, the search was cautious but methodical. Officers explained that in storms like this, it wasn't unusual for cars to get stuck or forced off the road. They reassured the family that she was likely out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But deep down, the family didn't believe it. They knew her patterns too well. She would have called if she could. She would have found a way to let them know the baby was safe. Silence was the one thing that didn't make sense. As the hours turned into days, the family's fragile explanations began to collapse. Every possibility they clung to was ruled out. No hospital had admitted her. No tow truck had pulled her from a ditch. No neighbor had spotted her stranded at a gas station. The storm that should have only delayed her had instead erased her, leaving nothing behind but questions. The baby's crib sat untouched, the house frozen as she had left it, proof that she fully intended to return. Relatives refused to rest. They organized their own search parties, driving through fields and rural cut-throughs, calling her name into the wind as though she might somehow hear them. They checked creeks, riverbanks, even abandoned barns where she might have taken shelter. Each failed lead cut deeper, every dead end amplifying the dread. The weight of not knowing pressed harder than grief ever could. It wasn't just fear of loss. It was the unbearable possibility of not understanding what had happened. Authorities began compiling records, traffic cameras, witness statements, phone pings. But the storm had wiped out much of the evidence. Cameras had been disabled by power failures. Witnesses remembered little beyond flashes of headlights on water-slick roads. Phone towers had gone down, leaving no trail to follow. The storm had not only taken her, it had taken the very evidence of her last steps. Her family replayed the final hours over and over in their minds. They remembered the calm way she had strapped her baby into the car seat. They remembered her voice saying it was just a quick visit. They remembered how ordinary it all had seemed and how fast the ordinary had collapsed. Some believed she must have swerved off the road, hidden in a ditch the storm had already filled. Others whispered darker fears, that someone might have taken advantage of the chaos, that the storm had been the perfect cover for something else. By the end of the first week, panic had taken full control. The storm was over, skies cleared, but she and her child were still gone. No car, no belongings, no trace of two lives that should have been simple to find. The disappearance didn't just feel wrong, It felt impossible. And yet, the evidence was unshakable. A mother and her baby had driven off into the storm, and they had not come back. The silence left behind was more suffocating than the rain ever had been, pulling her family deeper into dread. What had started as a drive across town had already begun to turn into a nightmare that no one could explain. When the official search began, the storm had already reshaped the land into something unrecognizable. Roads were cracked and buried under debris, trees uprooted, ditches filled with brown rushing water. What should have been a straightforward drive between one home and another was now a labyrinth of washed-out paths and unstable bridges. Police began with the expected route, sending cruisers along the main road and deputies into side paths, but the landscape itself resisted their efforts. Every mile seemed to hold new obstacles: mudslides that cut off stretches of asphalt, rivers that had spilled over their banks, farm fields turned into lakes. If she had gone off the road, even by a few feet, it was possible the storm had covered every trace within minutes. Helicopters were dispatched when skies cleared briefly, scanning the landscape from above. The logic was simple. A vehicle was hard to hide. It should have left tracks, broken fences, tire marks, something to mark its path. Yet as they combed the route again and again, there was nothing. Her car was nowhere to be seen. The image of an entire vehicle, a mother and her baby, vanishing without evidence weighed heavily on both officers and relatives. It made no sense. In disasters, wreckage is usually the one thing that can always be found. Here, it was as if the storm had swallowed her whole. Search parties of volunteers joined in, some wading through chest-deep water, others carrying sticks to prod through reeds and swollen creeks. They were determined to find even the smallest sign, a bumper, a car seat, a scrap of fabric, but every effort came up empty. They trudged through the wreckage of barns and sheds flattened by the storm, thinking she might have taken shelter, but the buildings were silent and bare. The mud clung to boots and slowed their progress, and still they found nothing. At first, investigators considered the possibility that she had taken an alternate route. Maybe she tried to avoid the worst of the flooding and detoured through back roads. Deputies mapped every plausible path she might have taken and began working outward in a grid, but those searches too revealed nothing. Each report came back the same: no skid marks, no debris, no evidence of a crash. As days passed, that absence grew more chilling than anything else. It wasn't just that she was gone. It was that she seemed never to have existed on the road at all. The family's hope began to collapse under the weight of that silence. They knew how careful she was, especially with her baby. She wouldn't have sped, wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks. They couldn't imagine her driving recklessly into danger. If her car had slid into water, it should have left a trail. If she had pulled over, someone should have noticed. Every logical explanation broke apart against the one fact no one could ignore: her car had vanished. Investigators checked parking lots, abandoned rest areas, and rural gas stations, fearing she might have broken down and left the car behind. Nothing. Her license plate didn't appear on any camera stills from before the power outages. Even wrecking yards and towing companies were contacted in case her vehicle had been brought in anonymously, but none had it. To the community, it was as if both mother and child had driven into the storm and been erased without a trace. Theories began to shift. Some believed she had been washed into one of the rivers, her car dragged under so quickly no one could see. Others suggested foul play, that the storm was the perfect cover for someone who had planned to take her. The sheriff's office urged calm, reminding everyone that the storm itself was unpredictable and destructive enough to cause her disappearance on its own. But in private, even deputies admitted to each other how strange it was. Cars don't just vanish. By the end of the second week, exhaustion set in. Volunteers who had spent days searching through wreckage began to lose faith. Authorities scaled back air support, keeping only a few patrol cars to monitor tips that never led anywhere. The family, however, refused to let go. They drove the route again and again, staring into ditches and fields as though something invisible might suddenly appear if they looked hard enough. Each trip ended the same way, with silence, frustration, and growing fear. The wreckage of the storm remained long after the clouds had cleared. Roads reopened, bridges were repaired, and life for most people slowly returned to normal. But for her family, nothing was normal. They lived with the unbearable contradiction. In a world where debris from the storm was scattered everywhere, from rooftops to fields miles away, the one thing that couldn't be found was her. A car large enough to weigh thousands of pounds, a baby stroller that should have been in the back seat, the mother who had left home for a simple drive. None of it had surfaced. Each day that passed without discovery deepened the mystery and sharpened the grief. The authorities' reports grew thinner, the official search narrowed, but the family's obsession only grew. They began keeping maps of their own, marking where they had driven, where they had searched, and where they would look next. To them, it was impossible that she could just vanish. Somewhere out there, the car had to be waiting. The question was where, and why no one could see it. The storm had moved on, leaving behind broken houses and flooded fields, but for her family it left something worse, the hollow ache of unanswered questions. The mother and her child should have been easy to find. Instead, the absence of her car was now the loudest evidence of all. It was not a crash, not an accident anyone could see. It was a disappearance, and the silence it left behind felt like a wall closing in. And as the days blurred into weeks, those searching began to realize this wasn't just a delay in rescue. It was the beginning of a mystery no one yet understood. In the weeks that followed, what began as a desperate search for a mother and her child slowly shifted into something darker. The absence of her car gnawed at investigators and family alike. Police had seen difficult cases before, but almost always there was a starting point: skid marks, debris, eyewitness accounts, something tangible. Here, there was only silence. That silence began to breed theories, and theories carried their own kind of weight. Each one seemed to pull the family in a different direction, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew. Relatives remembered that in the days before the storm, she had argued with her estranged partner. Their relationship had been tense for months, strained by custody disagreements and whispered accusations of neglect. Some family members wondered if he had something to do with her disappearance, that maybe the storm had nothing to do with it at all. Police didn't ignore the possibility. They questioned him carefully, noting his alibi and examining his phone records, but nothing concrete placed him near her that night. Still, the shadow of suspicion lingered, and for many, his name became a quiet undercurrent in every conversation. Neighbors offered a different kind of lead. A few reported seeing headlights swerving off the road during the height of the storm. To some, it looked like a vehicle struggling against the downpour, perhaps sliding toward a ditch. To others, it seemed intentional, like someone turning off the main road into the fields. The reports were inconsistent, blurred by the rain and fear of that night, but they fueled new speculation. If it was her car, where had it gone? If it wasn't, why did the image of those headlights feel so important? Investigators followed the tips, sweeping fields and ditches yet again, but once more came up empty. As weeks turned into months, rumors began to spiral beyond control. Some suggested she had staged her disappearance, overwhelmed by her life and desperate to start over somewhere else. That theory felt cruel to those who knew her best, especially when her baby was factored in. No one who loved their child as fiercely as she did would abandon them. Others leaned toward darker fears, that she had been taken, pulled off the road by someone who knew the storm would hide their tracks. The storm became less of an explanation and more of a mask, a force that could have hidden anything from view. Inside the sheriff's department, unease spread. The lack of evidence meant every possibility had to stay on the table, but the wider the investigation stretched, the thinner the facts became. Detectives combed through her phone and bank records, looking for signs of planning, but nothing pointed to a voluntary disappearance. She hadn't withdrawn money, hadn't packed belongings, hadn't sent a final message. To the contrary, her life appeared anchored in the ordinary routines of motherhood: diaper schedules, grocery lists, doctor's appointments. She had left home expecting to come back. Her family clung to that belief. They refused to entertain the idea that she had left willingly. For them, the storm had to be the answer. She must have been swept off the road, trapped somewhere no one had thought to look. Yet, even as they said it, the logic frayed. Search teams had checked the rivers. Divers had gone into the swollen creeks. Farmers had walked their fields. How could a car simply vanish? Their grief was tangled in that contradiction. To believe she was lost to the storm was to believe she could still be found. To admit she wasn't meant accepting something worse, that someone else had taken her. The community whispered its own theories. At church gatherings and grocery stores, people speculated in hushed voices about what really happened. Some pointed at her estranged partner, convinced he had orchestrated something and used the storm as cover. Others suspected strangers, someone who saw an opportunity in the chaos and acted on it. Every conversation added new layers until the story of her disappearance became less a tragedy and more a mystery woven with suspicion. For the family, it was torture to hear her name used that way, reduced to rumor instead of remembered as a person. Investigators, caught between mounting pressure and dwindling evidence, found themselves chasing shadows. They followed up on reported sightings of her car in distant counties, all of which collapsed under scrutiny. They checked with scrapyards in case her vehicle had been illegally stripped, but none matched the records. Each dead end deepened the sense of unease inside the department. A missing person case without evidence is one thing, but a missing mother and child with a missing vehicle was something else entirely. It was as though 3 lives had been erased in one sweep of the storm. At night, her relatives replayed every detail in their minds, searching for something they had overlooked. Had she said anything unusual before leaving? Had her mood been different? Some recalled her looking distracted that morning, though others insisted she had been calm. Memories began to blur, distorted by grief and the unbearable need for answers. They pored over old photos, hoping for comfort, but the images only sharpened the ache. Theories collided with emotions, leaving them trapped between hope and dread. By the end of the 3rd month, the case had become less about finding her and more about questioning the impossible. If she'd crashed, why wasn't there wreckage? If she had left willingly, why take her baby? If she had been taken, how had no one seen it? Each answer gave way to another question, circling endlessly. Theories piled on top of one another, but none could explain the most haunting truth. She had vanished without leaving a trace, and the storm had left behind only silence. That silence grew heavier with time. It pressed on investigators, on relatives, on neighbors who once believed answers were only days away. Instead of fading, her absence expanded, filling every space with uncertainty. Theories gave people something to hold on to, but none of them felt right, none of them gave peace. And as hope continued to wither, dread took its place, tightening its grip with each passing day. Something had happened that night, something the storm had hidden, and the longer it remained unseen, the more terrifying the possibilities became. Word count. 900 search dogs were brought in once the rains finally eased, but the ground they were asked to cover was nearly impossible. Fields that once carried the scent of crops and cattle now reeked of mud and stagnant water. And the dogs faltered as their paws sank into the muck. Trails washed clean by floodwaters left them with nothing to follow. Handlers gave them worn pieces of the mother's clothing, hoping for a spark, a lead, anything. But each search ended the same way. Confusion, whines of frustration, and heads lowered in defeat. If she had been nearby, the storm had stolen her scent long before the dogs arrived. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades rattling windows as they scanned fields now shining like mirrors under the sun. From above, the land seemed open, exposed, incapable of hiding a car. Yet nothing revealed itself, no flash of metal, no disturbed soil, no outline in the flooded fields. Pilots marked areas for ground crews to investigate, but when officers slogged through, they found only waterlogged soil and debris. Each flight felt more futile than the last, and eventually, even those searches slowed. On the ground, the community gathered in vigils that became increasingly emotional. At first, they were fueled by hope, candles raised against the darkness with prayers that she and her baby would return. As days turned into weeks, those same vigils grew heavier, voices cracking, and silence filling longer stretches of time. People who barely knew her began crying beside her family, drawn in by the haunting thought that someone could vanish so completely in a place they all considered home. Her photo was tacked to bulletin boards, pinned to grocery store entrances, taped to light poles, her smiling face staring back at the people who now whispered about her fate. Local headlines carried her story for weeks, but with every passing edition, the words, "no new leads," seemed to overshadow everything else. Reporters pressed investigators for updates, but detectives had little to offer. They admitted only that they were facing a mystery compounded by a storm unlike any in recent memory. The public sympathy was genuine, but as time dragged on, frustration built. Some accused the authorities of failing, others turned suspicion on the family itself. The search for the mother and her baby was no longer just about evidence. It was about managing a growing sense of unrest. For her relatives, waiting became unbearable. Her parents, siblings, and cousins began retracing the route themselves, sometimes driving the same stretch of road multiple times in a single day. They slowed at every culvert, every dip in the road, every ditch swollen with water, hoping for a glimpse of something that others had missed. Nights were spent poring over maps, drawing circles around potential routes, marking off areas already searched. Some relatives convinced themselves the car had to be within a mile of the main road. Others believed it had gone far off course. Their unity was fragile, fractured by grief and obsession, each person desperate to be the one who discovered the truth. Investigators noticed the family's intensity, but also understood it. They had seen this before, the way a lack of answers hollowed people out, replacing hope with a gnawing obsession. Detectives fielded daily calls from relatives insisting on new theories, pressing them to recheck areas, questioning why certain leads hadn't been pursued. While officially patient, some officers admitted privately they were trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. Every road had been searched, every possible location inspected, and still there was nothing. The mother and her baby remained shadows in a storm that had long passed. Neighbors, too, began their own searches. Farmers checked their fences and ponds. Hunters scouted trails deeper into the woods, convinced that fresh eyes might succeed where official searches had failed. Yet these independent efforts only fueled the unease. Each fruitless trip reinforced the impossible nature of her disappearance. The land itself seemed to conspire against them, a constant reminder of how easily the storm had swallowed two lives without leaving a trace. With no physical evidence, suspicion began filling the void. Conversations around dinner tables turned accusatory, with some claiming the estranged partner must be responsible, while others believed she had tried to flee her life. Even those closest to her weren't spared. Whispers circulated that maybe someone in the family knew more than they admitted. Theories became a way for people to manage their fear, but for her relatives, it was a second wound, compounding their loss. With suspicion, they could neither escape nor disprove. As months passed, the vigils grew smaller. The reporters moved on, the headlines faded, and news stories replaced hers in the papers. But the family's obsession did not fade. They kept searching, often alone, driven not by faith they would find her alive, but by the crushing need to find anything at all. A piece of her car, a child's toy, a sign that the world hadn't simply erased them both. Instead, they returned from every search empty-handed, their grief deepened by each unanswered question. What began as a community united by tragedy was slowly unraveling into something more fragile. Hope was still there, flickering faintly, but it was no longer enough. The longer she remained missing, the heavier the silence grew, pressing down on everyone who had once believed she would be found. The storm had left behind wreckage across the county, but for her family, the real wreckage was invisible, the hollow space where answers should have been. And as they faced yet another day without discovery, the unbearable thought settled deeper, that maybe the truth wasn't out there to be found at all, and the mother and her baby had vanished into a mystery no one was prepared to solve. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day the search lost its urgency. In the beginning, every cruiser, every volunteer, every helicopter felt like a lifeline stretched toward hope. But now the skies were clear, the roads repaired, and the fields dried back to their natural shapes, and still there was no trace of her. The official search began to scale down. Deputies who once spent their shifts combing ditches were reassigned. Helicopters no longer circled, even the dogs were called off. The sheriff's office kept the file open, but privately, investigators admitted they had little left to chase. The storm had given them no evidence, and now, in its silence, there was nothing left to pursue. Her partner continued to insist on his innocence. He appeared at press conferences, sometimes stiff, sometimes defensive, repeating that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Detectives scrutinized him, questioned his alibis, compared his timeline to hers, but no proof tied him to the night she vanished. Still, suspicion lingered in the air. Theirs had been a fractured relationship, marred by custody disputes and bitter arguments, and in the eyes of many, that was enough to paint him guilty. He became a figure whispered about in grocery aisles, glares following him at gas stations. For him, there was no escape from the shadow cast by her absence. Her family, meanwhile, refused to let the case fade into the background. They begged for answers at every opportunity, writing letters, holding small vigils even after the larger crowds disappeared. They met with detectives weekly, pressing for updates that grew shorter and less detailed with time. The family shared photos with media outlets, hoping renewed attention might draw out a lead. They clung to her belongings still left at home, her baby's toys, her folded laundry, as if keeping her presence alive would force the truth into the open. But the silence only deepened, leaving them shouting into an emptiness that refused to answer. Whispers of foul play never stopped. Some were convinced the storm was just a coincidence, that someone had used its chaos as cover. Others believed she never made it out of her driveway, that perhaps she had been followed or intercepted before even reaching the main road. In the absence of hard facts, the theories fed on themselves. The more people speculated, the more the family felt crushed by doubt. Each rumor added new wounds, accusations that she had run away, insinuations that the baby's father knew more than he admitted, suggestions that maybe the family themselves were hiding something. Each one was a knife twisted deeper. The physical evidence that should have anchored the investigation never materialized. Her car seat, the diaper bag she always carried, the stroller she kept in the trunk, none of it was ever recovered. For investigators, that absence was damning. Items like that don't simply vanish. If a car had gone into a river, something should have surfaced by now. If foul play was involved, something should have been discarded and found. Instead, the storm seemed to have swallowed every physical trace of her life at once, as though she and her child had been lifted from the world without warning. Detectives began to admit privately that they had no idea what had happened. Some still believed she had crashed in a spot they hadn't found, buried by mud or pulled under by water too deep to search safely. Others leaned toward the possibility of an abduction. None could explain how an entire vehicle could disappear so completely. The lack of evidence was not just frustrating, it was unnatural. Police aren't accustomed to solving cases without clues, and this one had stripped them of everything. Behind closed doors, they called it a ghost case, one that would sit on the shelf until someday, maybe, something broke loose. For her relatives, waiting was unbearable. Each holiday without her deepened the wound. Each birthday of the baby she had once held left them hollow. They imagined milestones that never came to pass, the child's first steps, her laughter echoing through the house, all stolen in a single night. The mother's absence was not just physical. It was an emptiness that reshaped every gathering. Conversations trailed off into silence. Smiles felt fragile. Every ordinary routine was haunted by what was missing. The cold silence of the case infected everything it touched. What began as a community tragedy faded into a private torment for those closest to her. Neighbors stopped asking for updates. Friends stopped showing up at vigils. The case had settled into a limbo that was worse than grief. Grief, at least, is final. This was a wound that never closed, a question that circled endlessly with no answer in sight. For the family, life moved forward in appearance only. Beneath it, time had frozen on the night she disappeared, leaving them stuck in an endless storm even as the world outside moved on. And in that silence, obsession grew. Her family members continued driving the route even when police no longer searched. They scoured maps, plotted theories, returned to the same fields and rivers in the hope that something overlooked might finally reveal itself. Each trip ended in disappointment, but they couldn't stop. The not knowing was worse than the exhaustion, worse than the ridicule from those who had already accepted she would never be found. They were desperate to keep her alive in the world, even if only through their determination to keep looking. The case had become defined by what was missing, not what was known. A mother, a child, a car, and every belonging that should have marked their existence on that road. The storm had taken them into its chaos, and when it receded, it left behind nothing but silence. And that silence was the cruelest part of all. It didn't just bury the truth. It left her family stranded in a void where hope and despair collided, with no way to know which one would win. 5 years passed before anything shifted. By then, the case had slipped into the shadows of memory for most of the community, spoken of only in fragments, like an old rumor too heavy to revisit. For her family, the years had been hollow, filled with anniversaries that brought no answers and milestones marked only an absence. The storm that took her had long since become a piece of local history, remembered for the destruction it caused, but her name had grown quieter with time. It seemed the earth itself had sealed the truth away. Then, one early spring morning, a farmer took his tractor into the fields to prepare the ground for planting. The soil was soft from thawing frost, and the machine hummed steadily until the plow jolted to a violent stop. At first, he thought he had struck a buried rock or a piece of old farming equipment left behind generations earlier. He climbed down, annoyed, and began clearing away the packed dirt with his hands. Beneath the surface, he found not stone but jagged, rusted metal, its edges twisted and half-decayed. The sight unsettled him. This wasn't farm machinery. This was something different. The farmer stood back, staring at the fragments breaking through the earth. The soil smelled of rust and age, roots twisting around the metal like veins. His mind leapt to the stories he had heard, the ones everyone in the county had heard, the mother, the baby, the car that had never been found. His hands shook as he reached for his phone and called authorities. He barely got the words out, but the meaning was clear. They needed to come, and they needed to come fast. When deputies arrived, they examined the fragments with grim precision. What they saw confirmed the farmer's unease. This wasn't scrap. It was a vehicle. The soil around it was thick and compacted, as though years of erosion and planting had pressed the ground down tight, sealing it away. Excavation began almost immediately. Crews with shovels and heavy equipment tore into the field, peeling back layers of earth that had hidden the wreckage for half a decade. With each bucket of soil removed, more of the vehicle came into view. Its frame collapsed and warped, its paint almost gone, its windows shattered into shards barely recognizable as glass. The scene drew silence. Deputies, forensic experts, and locals who gathered at the field all knew the same thought but didn't dare speak it. A car had been found buried beneath the farmland, and there was only one case in the county that matched such a disappearance. The sheriff's office cordoned off the field, refusing to let curiosity overwhelm the gravity of the moment. What had been rumor and uncertainty for years now had the potential to unravel into answers, no matter how grim. As the digging continued, the vehicle's details emerged. The outline of a 4-door sedan. Wheels twisted into the soil. Roots had grown through parts of the chassis, nature trying to claim what human eyes had missed. Investigators noted how deeply it had settled, how the soil had shifted over years of flooding and planting, pressing the car farther down. It was clear now how it had remained hidden. The storm had likely carried it off the road into the field, mudslides burying it instantly, and as the years passed, the land had folded it into itself. Excavation slowed when the cabin was finally exposed. The air grew heavy as forensic teams peered inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom of rust and dirt. The vehicle had become a tomb. Seats collapsed inward, dashboard crushed, but enough structure remained to confirm what they feared. Human remains were still inside. Bones rested in the driver's seat, slumped against the wheel. Tangled fragments of fabric clung to the metal frame. In the back, smaller pieces, too small to mistake, rested where a car seat would have been. Forensic teams worked methodically, documenting every detail before moving anything. The farmer watched from a distance, his face pale. He hadn't meant to stir up the past, but his plow had done what years of searching couldn't. It had unearthed the truth. And yet, As investigators carefully removed the remains, the family who had begged for answers all these years were nowhere near. They had no idea that their nightmare was about to break open. News spread quickly. Word that a buried vehicle had been found traveled from farm to town in hours, and soon the site became a gathering point for whispers. People who had long assumed she was gone now felt a cold certainty settling in. This was her car. After all the theories, the rumors, the accusations, it had been here the whole time, under their feet. What the storm had taken, the earth had hidden. Now, by chance, the land itself had given it back. Investigators announced little at first, confirming only that a vehicle had been recovered and remains were inside. But everyone knew what that meant. For the family, the phone calls came quickly, their hearts leaping and breaking all at once. For 5 years they had lived in limbo, torn between hope and dread. Now, dread was arriving at their door. The silence that had once been unbearable was about to be replaced with an answer they had long demanded but never truly prepared to face. The excavation site was sealed, the remains carefully packaged for forensic study. Detectives said nothing publicly, but the private conversations among them carried the same weight. They had finally found her. The only question that lingered was how much truth the earth had managed to preserve, and whether it could explain not just where she had been all these years, but what exactly had happened on that storm-soaked night when a mother and her baby vanished without a trace. The hikers hadn't meant to wander far from the marked trail. It was early autumn, the air crisp and thin in the hills, and they were chasing a viewpoint rumored to offer a sweeping look across the valley. But as they pushed through undergrowth, one of them froze. Something jagged rose from the soil, wrapped in vines and moss, a sliver of rusted metal that looked out of place against the green. At first they dismissed it as mining scrap. These hills had long histories of abandoned equipment, but as they moved closer, the details sharpened. Curved aluminum, faded paint, a fragment of lettering that looked too deliberate to be chance. One of them leaned in, brushing away the moss, and there it was, aviation markings, worn but unmistakable. What they had stumbled upon was no relic of mining. It was something far more haunting. They alerted authorities immediately, their voices shaky as they relayed what they'd seen. Within hours, deputies hiked to the site, guided by GPS pins the hikers had dropped. The undergrowth was thick, and the climb was treacherous. But then the twisted metal came into view, more than a fragment this time. Pieces of fuselage lay strewn across the slope, some tangled in tree roots, others half buried by years of erosion. The investigators' faces turned grim. This was no doubt an aircraft, and not just any aircraft. There had been one missing from the region for nearly 20 years, an unsolved disappearance that had haunted both authorities and families alike. Over the next few days, recovery teams were flown in. Helicopters hovered low over the ridge, winching down specialists who began mapping the site. The crash wasn't concentrated in one place. The wreckage spread across hundreds of feet, scattered by impact and concealed by 2 decades of growth. What struck investigators most was how deeply the forest had reclaimed it. Trees had sprouted through the torn fuselage, moss blanketed the twisted frame, and soil had nearly consumed smaller fragments. It was no wonder search teams in the early years had failed to find it. The hills themselves had hidden the truth. The identification process moved quickly. Serial numbers on the larger pieces confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was the missing plane. For 20 years, families of the passengers had lived with the torment of not knowing, speculating whether it had gone down in mountains, forests, or rivers, always clinging to rumors of sightings or survival. Now, in one moment, the uncertainty collapsed into stark reality. The plane had been here the whole time, waiting to be found. Excavation was painstaking. Forensic experts combed through every section of wreckage, searching not only for remains but for clues about what caused the crash. Inside one section of the fuselage, they discovered the remnants of seats, torn and rusted, with scraps of fabric still clinging to frames. Human remains began to surface. Fragile bones buried under layers of soil, fragments of clothing caught in twisted aluminum. Each discovery was catalogued carefully, wrapped in silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of helicopters. For investigators, the wreckage raised as many questions as it answered. The impact site suggested the plane had come in low, clipping trees before slamming into the slope. But there were no signs of fire, no scorched earth, no charred fragments. Whatever had gone wrong, it hadn't ended in flames. That detail alone deepened the mystery. Pilots had once speculated about weather interference, fuel problems, even sabotage. Now, the wreckage itself might hold the key. Families of the missing gathered in hushed groups as word spread. Some wept at the confirmation, others sat in stunned silence. For years they had lived in limbo, unable to fully grieve without proof, unable to move forward without knowing. Now, with confirmation, grief surged anew. Sharp and immediate, as though no time had passed. One family member admitted the discovery was both a relief and a punishment. Relief that the plane had been found, punishment that it had taken so long. Media descended quickly, cameras capturing the slope where jagged aluminum jutted out of earth like bones of a forgotten tragedy. Headlines framed it as closure, but those closest to the case knew better. This wasn't closure. This was the opening of wounds that had never healed, and the haunting question lingered. Why had the plane gone down? The markings confirmed its identity, but the truth of its final moments was still locked inside those broken wings and fractured engines. Authorities promised a full investigation. Engineers, aviation experts, and forensic specialists would analyze every piece brought down from the slope. But even as the work began, everyone knew the passage of time had stolen much. Evidence of mechanical failure, weather patterns, or pilot decisions might be buried too deep in decay to ever reveal themselves. The forest had not only hidden the plane, it had slowly erased it. Still, one fact stood above the rest. After nearly 2 decades of searching, rumors, and restless grief, the missing plane had finally been found. What hikers stumbled upon by chance had undone years of failed searches. The hills had kept their secret well, but chance had pried it open. And as investigators prepared to carry out the remains and catalog the debris, one thing became painfully clear. The missing weren't missing anymore. They had been here all along, waiting beneath moss and roots for someone to find them. Crash investigators approached the site with the kind of silence reserved for sacred ground. Every step was deliberate, every motion logged, because this was not just a wreck. It was the final resting place of human lives. The fuselage lay in fractured sections across the slope, its skin torn and curled back like paper that had been crumpled in an instant. Engines were half buried in rock, wedged so deeply it would take heavy equipment to move them. Investigators noted immediately that the impact must have been violent, the sort that leaves no chance for survival. Yet what unsettled them most was how much of the aircraft still told its story after nearly 2 decades of weather, soil, and silence. They began with mapping, photographing every angle of twisted aluminum before removing even the smallest fragment. In some places, the wreckage had fused with the hillside, metal crushed against stone, vines winding through seat frames, roots piercing through the walls of the cabin. But in sheltered pockets of terrain, eerie preservation had taken hold. A suitcase, its leather cracked but intact, lay under a fallen wing. Clothing still folded inside carried the faint outlines of a family photo pressed between fabric layers. A pair of eyeglasses rested in the soil, lenses clouded but unbroken. These artifacts became ghostly markers of the passenger's final journey, silent witnesses that had waited to be uncovered. For days, teams combed through the site inch by inch. Small fragments were bagged and tagged, shards of paneling, charred wiring, seatbelts still buckled though attached to nothing. Each discovery was methodical, but the human remains were what everyone braced for. They found fragments scattered across different sections of the slope, bones mixed with soil and metal, some belonging to passengers who had been thrown clear on impact. Each find was a reminder that this was not simply debris. It was a graveyard spread across a mountainside. Then came the chilling discovery. In the forward section of what remained of the fuselage, partially buried beneath rust and stone, lay the skeletal remains of someone still strapped in. The outline of the seat was mangled, its frame twisted beyond recognition, but the harness was unmistakable, its buckles corroded but intact, still holding bones upright where the cockpit had once been. The investigators paused, the reality pressing hard against the sterile procedures they were trained to follow. After all the theories, after all the speculation, the pilot had never left his seat. He had been here the entire time, locked in the cockpit as the plane tore into the hillside. Carefully, they documented the position, photographing every detail before beginning the painstaking process of removal. Bits of fabric clung to the skeletal frame, fragments of uniform stitching faintly visible through decay. In the soil nearby, they found remnants of flight instruments, dials cracked and scattered, their glass faces shattered but still hinting at the chaos of that final moment. Forensic teams handled the remains with reverence, aware of the weight of what they carried. This was not just a body. It was the answer to a question that had tormented families for years. Back in the lab, DNA testing confirmed what investigators already suspected. The remains were indeed the missing pilot. After nearly 2 decades of rumor and speculation, his fate was no longer in question. The man at the controls had never walked away, never escaped into hiding, never survived in secret. He had died with his aircraft, still strapped in the seat where his final decisions had been made. For the families of passengers, this revelation was both a grim comfort and a haunting confirmation. Yet even with his identity confirmed, questions remained. Investigators examined the wreckage for signs of mechanical failure, searching engines and fuel lines for evidence of why the plane had gone down. But time had erased much of what they needed. Weathering, rust, and erosion made it impossible to determine with certainty whether an engine had stalled, whether fuel contamination had played a role, or whether human error had been the cause. The violent impact and 2 decades of exposure meant the crash site could answer where and when, but not definitively why. Families received the news in solemn gatherings. For some, the confirmation of the pilot's remains ended years of uncertainty. They no longer had to wonder if he had vanished intentionally, if he had fled responsibility, or if he had survived somewhere unknown. He had been there all along, buried in the hills with his passengers. For others, the answers cut deeper. Knowing he had been in the cockpit when the plane struck the slope only raised further questions about what decisions had led them there. Was he lost in weather? Was it equipment failure? Or had something else happened in those final minutes that no one would ever fully know? The crash site was sealed once the recovery concluded, the hillside marked as sacred ground. Crews carried down what they could for forensic study, but large sections of wreckage were left where they had fallen, too embedded in the land to remove without destroying the site. Families visited, standing on the slope where moss now grew over metal, leaving flowers and photographs as tributes. For them, this was no longer a rumor, no longer a question. It was the place where their loved ones had died, and where the truth had been buried until chance brought it back into the light. The forensic excavation had confirmed what many feared but never proved. The plane had crashed violently, scattering lives and metal across the hillside. The pilot had remained at the controls until the end, his remains a haunting anchor of the truth. Yet with that truth came silence. The storm of questions about why lingered, unanswered, leaving families to carry both closure and mystery in the same breath. The plane had been found, the pilot had been found. But the reason the aircraft fell from the sky remained buried in the wreckage, a secret the hillside seemed determined to keep. When the call finally came, the family braced themselves before they even picked up the phone. For 5 years, every ring had carried a shard of possibility. Maybe an update, maybe a sighting, maybe the news they had begged for. This time, the voices on the line were steady but heavy. Authorities asked them to come in, explaining that a discovery had been made in a farmer's field. The family's breath caught in their throats. They had prayed for answers, but the tone told them these answers would not bring the peace they once imagined. At the sheriff's office, investigators laid out what had been found: the rusted frame of a car buried deep beneath soil and roots. Personal items recovered inside, a necklace that her mother immediately recognized, and a child's blanket still faintly patterned, the edges stained by years underground. Forensics confirmed what the family already knew in their bones. The mother had never run away, never abandoned her child. She had fought to drive through the storm, but the earth itself had betrayed her, pulling her vehicle into the field where mud and water swallowed it whole. For the relatives who had defended her name against whispers and rumors, the confirmation was both vindication and devastation. They had always insisted she would never leave willingly, never walk away from her baby, never vanish by choice. Now, They were right. But that truth carried no joy, only the crushing reality that she had been lost all along, buried just out of sight while they searched every road, field, and river for 5 agonizing years. Investigators explained what they could. The storm that night had been among the worst in decades, washing out roads, collapsing embankments, and triggering mudslides across the county. The mother's car had likely been forced off the road by flooding and trapped in unstable soil. With rain pouring in torrents, the vehicle had been dragged down before anyone could react, sealed beneath shifting mud that hardened with time. To searchers in those early days, the land had shown nothing, no tracks, no debris, no evidence. The storm had hidden her so completely that finding her sooner may have been impossible, but understanding how did little to soften the pain of knowing. As they listened, her family clutched the items laid gently before them, the necklace she never took off, the blanket her baby had been wrapped in on the night they disappeared. These fragments were all that remained of 2 lives once so full of routine, laughter, and future plans. Holding them was unbearable, yet letting go felt unthinkable. They had begged for something tangible for years, and now that it was here, it cut deeper than the silence ever had. Her partner sat in the corner, shoulders tense, eyes red. For years he had lived under suspicion, whispered about in supermarkets and accused in quiet tones at vigils. Some had believed he had a hand in her disappearance, that he had used the storm as cover. Now, with the truth revealed, those suspicions evaporated, but the damage to his reputation and relationships lingered. He spoke little, only saying that he wished he could have cleared his name sooner, that he wished he could have brought her home himself. His grief was tangled, complicated by years of mistrust, but in that room, even he felt the heavy relief of truth. The news spread quickly through the community. For neighbors who had once believed rumors of abduction or escape, the discovery was sobering. It had not been foul play nor some hidden scandal. It had been the storm, the relentless, inhuman force of nature that had consumed her and her baby in minutes. Vigils reignited, but this time, candles were held not in hope, but in mourning. People brought flowers to the site where her car had been recovered, placing them along the edge of the farmer's field, a quiet recognition that the answers had finally come at an unbearable price. For the family, grief was raw in ways they hadn't anticipated. The years of not knowing had been torture, but they had allowed the mind to cling to possibilities. Now, there were no more possibilities, only certainty. They found themselves breaking down over the smallest details, the idea of her gripping the steering wheel, the sound of rain hammering her windshield, the thought of her baby crying in the back seat as the car slid from the road. The image of her, fighting to save them both but losing against the storm's force, was almost too much to carry. At her parents' home, the recovered belongings were placed in a box on the dining room table. Surrounded by photos of happier times, relatives gathered, touching the necklace, folding the blanket, holding on to them as though they could bring her back. For many, it was the first time they allowed themselves to cry openly. The silence that had haunted them was finally broken, but the heartbreak was sharper now, shaped by the truth of what had been taken from them. Investigators closed the meeting by assuring the family that the case was resolved. There had been no foul play, no conspiracy. The storm had hidden her too well. For the sheriff, it was closure. For the family, it was only the beginning of another kind of grief. The endless searching had ended, but so too had the fragile hope that kept them going. All that remained was to bury their loved ones properly, to mark the ground with names that had once been whispered in uncertainty. As they left the office, one relative said quietly that knowing the truth felt like losing her all over again. The storm had taken her once, and silence had taken her for 5 years more. Now, the truth had returned her, but only in fragments, leaving them with the impossible task of grieving both what they had lost and the years they had spent searching for what was already gone. Word count: 899. The sheriff's office announced the official closure of the case in a brief press conference that drew cameras, reporters, and a handful of weary community members who had lived with the story for 5 years. The words were simple, almost clinical. The missing mother and her infant child had been found. Their car unearthed by a farmer's plow in a field only a few miles from the road she was last seen driving. There was no crime, no abduction, no hidden plot. The storm itself had taken them, forcing her car from the road and sealing it beneath mud and water until time and nature had locked it away. With that, the file was marked closed, but for the family, closure was not peace. It was heartbreak carved into stone. In the days that followed, the weight of the discovery rippled outward. Neighbors and townspeople who once speculated about foul play or whispered theories now stood silent, shaken by the cruel simplicity of the truth. The mother they thought might have run away, the baby they feared had been taken, had been only yards from where they searched, trapped and buried in plain sight. It wasn't malice or mystery that had hidden them, but the raw force of nature, indifferent and absolute. The knowledge left the community unsettled, as though the ground beneath their lives could not be trusted, as though storms carried not just destruction, but secrets, capable of erasing people from the world. The family struggled to absorb it all. They had spent years begging for leads, following false hopes, and defending her name against suspicion. Now, every theory collapsed into a single explanation. She had fought to steer her car to protect her baby, but the rain had been stronger, the mud too deep. They imagined her hands gripping the wheel, her voice soothing her child in the back seat, the terror of realizing she couldn't stop what was happening. That picture haunted them more than the silence ever had. Knowing she had never abandoned them did not ease the grief. It sharpened it, leaving them with the unbearable truth that she had been there, struggling, as the storm swallowed them both. The items returned to the family became sacred relics. Her necklace, bent but still intact, was placed in a small velvet box on her mother's dresser. The child's blanket, stained and frayed, was folded carefully and locked away, too painful to hold yet too precious to discard. These fragments were all that was left to bridge the gap between the people they had lost and the endless void of years without them. Family members spoke of the belongings with reverence, as though they carried whispers of the lives cut short. The community sought its own way to reckon with the tragedy. Volunteers built a roadside memorial at the bend where she was last seen driving into the storm. A wooden cross was placed in the soil, surrounded by flowers, candles, and photographs. People stopped on their way to and from town, some leaving notes, others standing in silence. It became more than a marker. It was a reminder of fragility, of how easily lives could vanish when nature turned violent. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, and for a long time, the memorial became a gathering place where grief and reflection intertwined. The farmer who had unearthed the car returned to his work, but not without a sense of guilt. He admitted quietly to friends that he wished his plow had struck the soil years earlier, that perhaps the family could have been spared years of torment. But others reassured him that it wasn't his burden to carry. He hadn't hidden the car, the storm had. Time and earth had conspired to conceal it so thoroughly that only chance could have revealed it again. His discovery had not come too late. It had come when the land finally allowed it. For the investigators, closing the file was bittersweet. Many had carried the case in the back of their minds long after the searches ended, haunted by the unanswered questions, by the image of a mother and baby simply erased from the map. Now, the discovery confirmed what they had long suspected, but could never prove. The storm itself had been the culprit. Yet, even as the paperwork was signed, some admitted privately that the case would never leave them. It wasn't just another investigation. It was a lesson in how silence could be more devastating than death, how nature could bury not only evidence, but hope itself. As the family held a joint memorial service, the church filled with faces both familiar and distant. Some had stood beside them during the earliest searches, others had drifted away over the years, but now they all returned, united by the finality of the truth. The service was quiet, filled with long silences, broken only by the sound of stifled sobs. When the names of mother and child were read aloud, it was as though the room itself sank under the weight of what had been taken. The case was closed, but the grief was endless. For the family, closure meant carrying the cruel truth forever, that their loved ones had been hidden not by human hands, but by the fury of a storm and the slow patience of the earth. What the storm had stolen, the land had held tight, concealing them just out of reach until chance forced it back into view. In the end, they were not returned in life, not returned in peace, but in fragments and memories, in a cruel exchange that left behind more questions of fate and fragility than answers. The roadside memorial grew in the weeks that followed, layered with flowers that wilted and were replaced, candles that melted and were relit. The community mourned as though the tragedy had happened yesterday, not 5 years earlier. People driving by slowed their cars. Some honked gently, others bowed their heads. The land had given them back, but only after ensuring everyone would remember the cost. The storm had taken them in silence, the earth had kept them hidden, and now, finally, time had given them back. But for those who loved them, the return brought no comfort, only the cruel knowledge that